Peter Eisenman, you're in London in January '75 as a guest of ArtNet as part of the conference which Peter Cook organized around the subject of conceptual architecture. Before I ask simply one question, which I'd like you to answer as you see fit, I'd like to introduce you somewhat to those who are watching. You are a New Yorker, perhaps the original New Yorker Anglophile. I believe you have a PhD from Cambridge from the early days. You're a collector with many fetishes, books, prints, drawings, etc. You design many things. You're a publisher. You have in your time handled major research projects. You are a compere in the tradition of Diaghilev, perhaps, putting together many packages involving many people in many places. But most important, you direct the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. And I would like to ask some questions about this latter episode.
I would say, by the way, that's not most important, but I'll let that go and answer the questions.
Fair enough.
All right.
It's some 10 years ago, I believe, when you began on this notion of an institute, independent of all other bodies and freewheeling, which permits not only you, but a great many other people to operate, staff, students, and project into the New York milieu, and with your publications on a universal level. I think it would be very interesting for those of us in London to, who don't know very much about the history and objectives of the Institute, to hear from you about this.
The Institute, it's more properly about 7 or 8 years old, and I think that you have to take a little personal history, if I may.
Yes.
Because it certainly was designed as a vehicle for my own requirements. I mean, it didn't have any kind of polemical or overriding institutional notion. It was trying to see how I could solve the kinds of contradictions I found in my own life. I think you have to say that they started in England when I first came to England in '60, and the 3 years I spent here, both at Cambridge and often in juries at the AA. One realized that architecture was a way of life in England in those days, not only for architects, but people were the public at large was generally interested in architecture. There were columns in newspapers. There was a level of criticism in discussion both in Cambridge and in London about architecture. There was informed discussion at a general level. And I think this is partly due to the fact that the architects themselves saw architecture as a very important way. It was a way of life. It wasn't just designing a building, or it wasn't just a profession. It wasn't just something that was to be taught and codified. It was really a way of existence, and it combined a lot of things for them. This was something very different than we had or I thought ever had in the United States, because architecture was never conceived of as something other than a profession and as a useful activity toward what one might say the something that Colin Rowe has always said, the good life. They were artifacts of the good life as opposed to anything to do with the good society. Coming back from England to the United States, I went to Princeton to teach, and I went there for one specific reason, because it was the most backwater place that one could think of. I mean, it still lived in its Beaux-Arts heritage, really. It hadn't had a new faculty member in 17 years. And one went there to try and bring that kind of attitude, or try and catalyze that kind of attitude in Princeton. What one finds is it's very difficult to recreate Cambridge or the AA in the United States by merely importing Englishmen, which we did in vast quantities. Ken Frampton, James Gowan, Tony Vidler, Tony Erdley, all at one time, and at the same time were at Princeton. But that was merely an analog or a replica of something, and it didn't flourish within the context of the United States. And I wasn't necessarily flourishing in Princeton, because what I found was that there was a split between the practice of architecture and the teaching of architecture, and they didn't inform one another. And I felt very strongly that there was this natural dialectic in architecture between theory and practice, and that the university, situated in isolation in Princeton, did not offer enough reality to sustain the theory that it was professing to give. And the practice of architecture on Nassau Street in Princeton did not sustain enough theory to, or did not have enough reality to sustain, theory to sustain any reality. And so one said one's got to build some sort of hybrid, very similar perhaps to the model of the AA, probably that was in the back of my mind, whereby one could bring students into a climate where there was an ongoing work situation as well as an ongoing theoretical situation, and so that the student could, within his work, see its relationship to theory, and within his theoretical work, see its relationship to practice. That was the basic intention of the Institute. It never had a curriculum. It never had a philosophy. I think it, in one sense, has always tried to be, its only philosophy, if it stood for anything, was a critical discourse, to provide a vehicle for critical discourse, a qualitative critical discourse, and to, I think, in one sense, challenge the pervading empirical attitude that one found in the United States and one continues to find vis-a-vis architecture, that it is something useful, that it is something to be marketed, that it is a commodity, and that the architect was someone who carried these kinds of things out. And I think that the reason why I've always leaned toward Europe, and maybe misguidedly, to look toward the models for behavior, was that me always thought of architecture something more idealistic, and in certain cases something more normative. I think that's the general feeling that one's had behind the Institute. It's now developed from those early days when it's gone through several palace revolutions and changes of faculty, to a point.
It would be very interesting, as we're talking about the Institute as such, if you could go through the successive stages very briefly.
Right. But I will try and do it. We started with the idea was to bring graduate students from Cornell Urban Design, from Colin Rowe's program, to New York and give them a year in New York working on real projects. And we went to the City Planning Commission, and we had some friends, and Jack Robertson and Richard Weinstein, who were there, and with some interaction we began to take projects from the urban design group and work on them at the Institute. The first split came when Colin was very much more having his students do design studio than do real live projects and fit those projects into some theoretical context. And after the second year, we split. There was an out-and-out revolt at the Institute because the students didn't want to work on real things. They wanted to work on theoretical things, so that the Cornell program split apart. We then brought in Emilio Ambas and Kenneth Frampton, who both had been at Princeton at the time. Emilio is a young Argentinian, and Emilio very much saw the Institute's role as a non-service role. He saw it as one where the minute we began teaching again and offering something, we were falling back into the same trap that every other school would fall back into, that we were to generate our own projects and our own research. So we began to work on what is known affectionately as the Streets Project in the Institute, where we got a grant from the Department of Housing and Urban Development in Washington to study the whole idea of the street in history, its present context, its potential future use. And that was a 3-year research study, which we generated. In other words, we suggested the program to HUD, and we were funded. Therefore, we were not doing a service to them, but rather suggesting ways of operating. That's going to eventually result in a book when all the smoke clears. The second thing which we did of that sort was Kenneth developed an idea for low-rise, high-density housing, first as an idea, then as a program. We took the program to the Urban Development Corporation. They said if we get some funding, we could go ahead and develop a prototype. We secured the funding. In each case, again, we were suggesting ideas to corporate structures or to development structures who were not concerned necessarily with these ideas. And we were very much more successful, I think, with the housing because, in fact, we not only developed a program for the housing, we developed a prototype, we were also given a commission to build 600 units. And that's under construction presently, and that's the work that Ken Frampton has been working on. A couple of years ago, we realized that we were very careful to realize that research grants, prototypical housing, and the money for these kinds of activities was drying up. And unfortunately, we had to go into service again. And the service, though, we tried to describe as something, again, unique. We thought of an idea where undergraduate liberal arts majors from various colleges could come to the Institute for a year, be exposed to the theoretical and practical aspects of architecture, return to their campus, and then go on to architecture school or go on to some other form of education. The idea being that we would provide a consortium, not possible, provide a faculty and an intensity not possible at these diffuse colleges, so that we would be creating something out of the real problem that the liberal arts college has of maintaining itself and offering the kinds of things that students want, diverse things. So we have a 3-year grant to do this. We've got a consortium of 8 colleges: Smith, Amherst, Wesleyan, Sarah Lawrence, Brown, etc. Some of the better liberal arts colleges, and that's underway now. And a second program. So that's pre-professional education. We never wanted to get into competition with the professional schools. And then we are working on a program which is continuing education, where we do work with lay people at night and offer a program of lectures which Colin Rowe and many historians and practicing architects in New York participated in, and for which we're bringing Peter Cook and Dennis and Ron over this spring to do a kind of think tank for a condensed 2-week session. That's in our evening program, which we call Continuing Education. And then we have this magazine, which we're trying to develop a level of discourse internationally about ideas and to see architecture as a critical vehicle. In addition, we each carry on, we very much want to carry on our own work, and we're not a partnership so much as we are individual mounds within a total structure, and we can do our own work. We go out and get our own monies and our own funding to do specific projects, whether it be research into semiology, research into housing, actual construction of housing, or private individual house, or writing a book. So that describes the broad range of activities, or the narrow range of broad activities.
Thank you very much, Peter Eisenman. Did it